In the depths of World War I, a spark ignited that would change the course of history forever: the Russian Revolution. This was not a sudden blaze but a slow-burning fire stoked by years of political and social unrest. At the heart of this turmoil was Tsar Nicholas II. A man of considerable charm but questionable leadership skills, his reign was marked by a series of blunders and miscalculations that left his country teetering on the brink of disaster. The Tsar's inability to effectively manage his empire was painfully apparent in the Russo-Japanese War, where a humiliating defeat exposed the weaknesses of Russia's outdated military and the incompetence of its leadership. This military debacle, coupled with the Tsar's autocratic rule, stirred discontent among the Russian people, who were growing increasingly impatient with their leader's inability to address their needs. Meanwhile, the flames of unrest were being fanned by the harsh realities of life in early 20th century Russia. The vast majority of the population lived in abject poverty, while a small elite enjoyed unimaginable wealth. This stark divide between the haves and the have-nots created a fertile ground for revolutionary ideas to take root. As if these internal pressures weren't enough, the onset of World War I put further strain on the already fragile Russian society. The war was a drain on the country's resources, exacerbating the economic struggles of the Russian people. Moreover, the repeated military failures on the Eastern Front served as a harsh reminder of the incompetence of the leadership, further fueling the revolutionary flames. By the time 1917 rolled around, Russia was a powder keg, ready to explode. The Tsar's autocratic rule, the economic struggles, the military defeats, the social unrest, all these factors combined to create a perfect storm. The people were desperate and disillusioned, and they were ready for a change. The stage was set. The Russian people, desperate and disillusioned, were ready for a change. February 1917, a wave of strikes and protests swept across Petrograd, the then capital, marking the beginning of the end for the Romanov dynasty. The month was characterized by a series of protests, starting with the Women's Day demonstrations on February 23rd. With the city's factories operating at full capacity to support the war effort, conditions for workers were dire. Food shortages, low wages, and long hours sparked the initial protests, which rapidly grew into a full-scale revolt against the Tsarist regime. As the unrest escalated, the Tsar's troops, initially tasked with quelling the protests, began to defect and join the revolutionaries. The tide had turned against Tsar Nicholas II. His once loyal subjects now openly defied him. The Tsar, far from the capital and isolated at the front lines of World War I, was oblivious to the extent of the discontent. Meanwhile, in Petrograd, the Duma, Russia's legislative body, was in turmoil. Moderate politicians, led by Alexander Kerensky, were caught between the Tsar's autocratic rule and the growing revolutionary fervor. They saw the writing on the wall and began negotiations to form a provisional government. Back at the front, the Tsar received an ultimatum from his generals: abdicate or risk civil war. With his family's safety in mind and the country on the brink of chaos, Nicholas II abdicated on March 2nd, marking the end of 300 years of Romanov rule. The provisional government, led by Kerensky, stepped in to fill the power vacuum. However, their reign was short-lived. They struggled to address the issues that had sparked the revolution in the first place: the war, land reform, and food shortages. The stage was set for a new power to emerge. The Romanov dynasty had fallen, but the power vacuum left in its wake would soon be filled. Enter Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the radical socialists who would seize the opportunity to reshape Russia in their image. In the whirlwind of change and chaos that was Russia in 1917, one man and his party emerged from the shadows to seize control. Vladimir Lenin, a committed revolutionary, had spent years in exile, plotting and planning for this moment. In April of that year, he returned to Russia, ready to lead the charge against the provisional government that had taken over after the fall of the Tsar. Lenin arrived in Petrograd, the capital, with a clear vision and a powerful message for the people. His April theses, a set of 10 directives, called for an end to the war, no support for the provisional government, and the transfer of land to the peasants. In short, he promised peace, land, and bread, a slogan that resonated deeply with a war-weary and hungry population. But how did Lenin and the Bolsheviks seize power? The answer lies in the October Revolution, a pivotal moment in Russia's history. By this time, the Bolsheviks had managed to gain significant influence in the Soviets, the local councils that had sprung up across the country. They had also built a strong, disciplined party, ready to act when the time was right. And act they did. On the night of November 7th, the Bolsheviks launched a coup against the provisional government. With minimal resistance, they stormed the Winter Palace, the seat of the government, and declared their own rule. It was a dramatic and decisive moment that marked the end of the provisional government and the beginning of Bolshevik rule. The Bolsheviks had secured their grip on power, but the struggle was far from over. The years to come would see civil war, the creation of the Soviet Union, and the rise of Joseph Stalin. But for now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had achieved their goal. They had taken power in Russia and were ready to start building their socialist state. The Bolsheviks' rise to power sparked a brutal civil war that would determine the future of the nation. The conflict that ensued between 1918 and 1922 was not just a struggle for power, but a clash of ideologies. On one side, the Red Army, led by the Bolsheviks, sought to establish a socialist state. On the other side, the White Army was a loosely knit group of anti-Bolshevik forces, ranging from monarchists to liberals, who opposed the radical restructuring of society. The Civil War was a period of unprecedented violence and chaos. The Red Army, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, was ruthless, employing terror to suppress opposition. The White Army, though disorganized and lacking a unified command, fought tenaciously to restore the old order. Both sides committed atrocities, and millions lost their lives. In the midst of this turmoil, the Bolsheviks began to lay the foundations for what would become the Soviet Union. They seized control of the economy, nationalizing industry and redistributing land among the peasants. They also established a new political structure, based on Soviets or councils of workers and soldiers. Despite the ongoing conflict, they were determined to forge a new society. The turning point came in 1920. The Red Army, though initially outnumbered and poorly equipped, managed to defeat the White Army, thanks in part to the strategic genius of Trotsky. The victory of the Red Army, however, did not bring immediate peace. The country was devastated, and famine swept across the land. But the Bolsheviks had won the war, and they were now in a position to build the world's first socialist state. On December 30, 1922, the Soviet Union was officially established, marking the end of the Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks had come a long way from being a radical fringe group to ruling one of the largest and most powerful nations on earth. But their victory had come at an enormous cost, and the scars of the Civil War would haunt the Soviet Union for decades to come. The Civil War had ended and the Soviet Union was born, but the face of Russia was about to change once again. With Lenin's death in 1924, a new leader would emerge to take the reins of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. Stalin, a man of iron will and ruthless ambition, maneuvered his way to the top, outsmarting rivals to become the absolute ruler by the late 1920s. With power firmly in his grasp, he began to shape the Soviet Union in his vision. His policies, though transformative, were also marred by brutality and disregard for human life. Stalin introduced a series of ambitious economic programs known as the 5-year plans. These aimed to rapidly modernize the Soviet Union's largely agrarian economy into an industrial powerhouse. The drive towards industrialization was relentless and unforgiving. The cost of this rapid transformation was steep, paid in the currency of human suffering. Millions were uprooted, forced into labor, and many perished. But the cruelty of Stalin's regime did not stop at economic policies. He was infamous for his purges, a brutal campaign to root out perceived enemies within the Soviet Union. These purges swept across the nation, sparing no one. From high-ranking officials to ordinary citizens, anyone could be labeled an enemy of the state and meet a grim fate. Yet, despite the atrocities, the Soviet Union under Stalin did transform from a backward agrarian society into a global industrial superpower. It emerged as one of the victors of the Second World War, extending its influence across Eastern Europe and beyond. However, the human cost of this transformation was astronomical. The Russian Revolution had come full circle. From the fall of the Tsar to the rise of the Soviet Union, it was a period of upheaval and transformation that would forever shape the course of history. This chapter of history serves as a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink, but also the heights it can reach in the pursuit of progress.